Did you catch that when Lee started out reading the scriptures? The first time I picked it up, the first phrase she reads is, "The point is this." It's like what every preacher wants to do, The point is this. Would you just get the point? And here he is, the point is this. I mean, if he has to come out and say it, it must be pretty important, right? You who sow sparingly will reap sparingly, and you who sow generously will reap generously. God, who supplies seed to the sower and bread for food, will supply and multiply your seed for sowing and enrich the harvest of your righteousness. You will be enriched in every way for your great generosity, which will produce thanksgiving to God through us. So the story is this. He's writing this letter to the church in Corinth. It's not a big church, it's a small church, but we know that even though there's some slaves in the church, that there's also some masters in the church. And in other words, there's some poverty and there's some wealth. But the church in Jerusalem is a very poor church. It's also a small church. It's going through a difficult time. So Paul is asking the church in Corinth, in Greece, if they will send money to the brothers and the sisters in the church in Jerusalem. He's asking Gentiles to send money to Jews. I mean, in the ancient world particularly, this is not the kind of thing that generally goes on. And he's giving the rationale for why they should be doing this in the text. Basically, he's saying you got to trust in the sufficiency of God. God's going to supply the seed for growth, et cetera, et cetera. You have to let your resources flow. That's a loose translation. I'll get to it in a minute. And you have to use your resources as an expression of the values and meaning in your life. Trust in the sufficiency of God is not always the easiest thing to do, because we have an economy which is based on the fear of scarcity. Competition results. You might, I'm sorry, Debbie, I always pick on you because you sit up front here. But there might, if there's scarce number of resources available, then you and I are kind of duking it out for those. So our economy turns neighbors into rivals and strangers into threats. Threats about how we might use these resources that are available to us. Paul is asking us to turn to a whole different paradigm about the way that we think about our resources. Trust in the sufficiency of God. I've told some of you before about this female TV evangelist in Chicago who was standing up and asking for people to send money in, and she said, I prayed to God to give me enough money for my apartment, to pay the rent for my apartment, and God said to me, if you're faithful, I'll buy the building for you. You'll own the building. And then she looked right straight into the camera and said, you know what? I don't only own the building, I own the whole block. I just thought that was the greatest. I own the whole block. Okay, Paul is not talking about that. The Apostle Paul is not saying that, if you give this, then you're going to get all these things you really want. And you're going to become a rich and wealthy millionaire. No, God is sufficient. There will be enough. You're not going to own your whole block. So, what does it mean if God is sufficient? It means that we can give, and there will be a flow that happens. It's not the paradigm of fearful individualism. It's the paradigm of flowing collaboration. It's a whole different way of looking at the whole thing. When Sally and I moved out to New England, I was on my way to seminary. We came in the summertime. We worked at a camp up in New Hampshire. And there was a particular kid in this camp. His name was Dan. And he had a very short temper. And I know that because I played basketball with him. And he was always claiming that people were fouling him. And if he elbowed you and you said foul, he'd go, no way, no way. And my title was Bible director. Very esteemed title. I did not direct the Bible, by the way. I was in charge of, teaching. So I felt some responsibility for this young staff kid named Dan, and I took him aside and I made an extremely poignant clinical intervention. I said to him, Dan, have you ever considered counting to 10 when you get angry? I mean, that's about as good as clinical an intervention as you can make with a kid like that. Would you count to 10? And he went, I don't think that'll work. He said, I get mad, I just get mad. But when we were on the basketball court, at least, something would happen and somebody would foul him and he'd want to go, hey! And I'd go, 1, 2, 3, I don't know if it didn't work in his whole life, but we got him to calm down a little bit. Well, that fall, we moved down to Waltham outside of Boston. We lived on the 3rd floor of an apartment building, and we didn't have a refrigerator. And no big deal. We're young and in love. Who needs a refrigerator, I mean, really. So we put stuff on the back porch to keep it cool. Yeah, well, we had a retreat later that fall with these kids from who'd been at camp in the summer, and Dan was there, and other friends were there, and some of my other friends were making fun of me because we didn't own a refrigerator, and they'd say things like, if you go over to Denny's house, don't drink the milk. Don't drink the milk. So we're done with the retreat, and later that week I get a phone call from Dan. Hey, Denny, he says, are you home on Saturday? I said, yeah, we're home. He said, could I stop by late morning or so? Sure, that'd be fine. Knock, knock on the door, late morning Saturday. There's Dan, standing on our back porch, up 3 levels. Come here, he says, come here. So I walk out. I look down over the railing. Look down there. Here's this old guy standing there who I presume to be his father. And there is an old refrigerator strapped onto a dolly. He's waving and he says, we have a refrigerator here. Come bring it up. Thanks. And sure enough, there's the refrigerator. And I went down and we pushed the thing all the way up the stairs and we brought it in. And afterward, his father took me aside and said, listen, he said, I just wanted to thank you for all the time you gave to Dan this past summer. Can't tell you what it meant to him to think that somebody older than him would spend that kind of time and give him advice. So when I heard you needed a refrigerator, I knew I had an old one in my basement that was going to work for you. Flow. You get it? Flow. You give, but you don't give because you're going to get the whole block. You give because you're offering your resources into the flow, the collaborative flow of life. And it's going to come back to you. You are going to be enriched in righteousness, which is the word that Paul used. It's the other thing that it does using this paradigm of giving is it gives you an opportunity to express what your life means. You can stop the flow by hoarding, saving up all kinds of money because some emergency might come and, who knows, the world might blow up, so I'm going to need even more money. And we should save. I'm not saying you shouldn't save. I'm just saying that, all right, there's a limit, right? It's not about saving everything. It's about saving a little for a rainy day and putting the rest into the flow. Hoarding stops up the flow, as does self-centered consumerism. If you pile up all kinds of things, what kind of meaning is that in your life? A friend of mine died this past week. His name is Dean Bowman. He was quite a guy who gave many of his resources into the flow over his life, and they gave a depth of meaning to his life. You should read his obituary. I mean, would that we all would have an obituary that would have this kind of rich meaning in it. He was a public school teacher, didn't make a lot of money, lived in California, although his first 3 years of teaching, he went to some little village in Alaska called Unalakleet and taught there for 3 years, then came back and married his childhood sweetheart. He helped start a church in Scotts Valley, California, and he taught confirmation in that church for 45 years. Do you know what it's like to be trapped in a room with middle schoolers for 45 years? I mean, just think about that. Just a little bit. I mean, they're great kids. I love their energy. But 45 years. For the last 15 years, every Monday night, he has been a counselor on a suicide hotline. He loves kids. He gave his life to kids. He loved the church. Whoever you are, wherever you are in life's journey, you are welcome here. And he gave both his time and his talent and his treasure to the life of the church and other things as well. His life is full of meaning because he was willing to let his resources enter the flow. And it came, if he were here today, Dean would say, we visited him about 7 years ago, and our son was having struggles wandering in the wilderness, and we told him about it, and he just stood up. He said, look, he wants to come here. He can come here. He can live with us for a couple of years. That'd be fine. Sometimes young people need a little change, need a little shift. I think he meant different parents. No, he didn't mean that. So, trust the sufficiency of God. Let your resources go into the flow. They will come back to you. Let your resources express the meaning and the value of your life. So it's the week before Pledge Sunday, right? Next week we come in. There's one service, by the way, 10:30. Breakfast ahead of time at 9:15. And we bring our pledges forward. So, now it's the Sunday before that. And here's the point in the sermon where I'm supposed to kind of do the close, All right, I'm supposed to say something so strong that it'll just make you open up your wallets and give money to the church. So here's my close. It takes money to run a church, to do the ministry that we've got to do. If you're in a membership class, we ask you to give between 3 and 5% to the life of the church. Nobody's going to come, with a gun to your house if you don't, but we ask you to. The average gift to this church is just under $2,000. Sally and I give 4.5% of our combined income to the ministry of this church. There is great satisfaction and meaning in doing that, because this is a community of collaboration. This is a place where resources flow from one to the other, to the other, to the other. And that table there, that is the meal of collaboration. That is where we see the love of God flows from God to us and through us. So there's the close. That's it.